We thought as recently as 2 or 3 years ago that we might get away with as little as a meter, 3 feet of sea level rise this century. Those numbers now seem very optimistic indeed, and we're looking at 2 or maybe 3 times that much.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on over 30 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org. Today, the great climate activist Bill McKibben, an absurd Texas requirement, brave Syrian prisoners, some good news in a climate trial, and a tribute to Joanne Landy. Recently, Bill McKibben gave a major address at Yale University. We'll have part of it on the program today. He issues a grim challenge: step up the pace of replacing fossil fuels with renewables, or else face more extreme weather disasters in our hot new world.
You've heard a great deal about climate here in recent weeks. And my guess is that most of you are on board with the basic proposition that climate change is a deep problem and that we need to do something about it. And in that, you are like most people in this country and in this world. The polling data shows that quite clearly. Donald Trump notwithstanding, and more on him later, this intellectual argument about the existence of climate change is largely one, a consensus established within the scientific community long ago. So today, I want to try and advance the discussion a little further beyond that. The question, the word that I want to highlight here today, the focus of my remarks, will be the word pace. Okay? How fast are we going to deal with this crisis? And I'll try to do that in 5 parts. The first is to describe the pace of this unfolding crisis to date. I did, as Mary Evelyn said, write the first book about this back in 1989, which I am well aware was before many of you were born. At that time, we knew that we were in trouble. We understood that when you burned coal and gas and oil, you put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We knew that the molecular structure of CO2 trapped heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. What we did not know then was how fast this was going to happen and how hard it was going to pinch. And the story of the last 30 years is it's happening much faster and pinching much harder than people would have guessed. The most commonly used phrase by scientists in papers over the last 10 years has probably been faster than expected. The things that we're seeing now, the phenomenon playing out around the world, were things that 30 years ago we would have guessed would have happened late in this century. But as it turned out, the pace of climate change, the world was more finely balanced than we understood. So far, we have raised the temperature of our Earth 1 degree Celsius, 1.7 or so degrees Fahrenheit. That doesn't sound like an enormous amount, but in the context of the planet, it turns out to be quite large. We could express it in other units if we wanted to, and that might make it easier. Each day, the carbon that we've put in the atmosphere traps the heat equivalent of 400,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs. Okay? That's enough heat to do enormous things, and we can see them now unfolding. More than half of the summer sea ice in the Arctic is gone. Think about how much heat it takes to melt a continent-sized, millennia-old, meters-thick sheet of ice to turn it from white to blue. The planet looks, from a satellite, entirely different than it did 40 years ago. There is a lot less white up top. We're an ocean planet. 70% of our surface is the sea. And the sea we have forced to undergo astonishing changes in the most blink of an eye. Some of the carbon that we've poured into the atmosphere is absorbed in the seawater, and as it is absorbed, it changes the chemistry of that seawater. The ocean is roughly 30% more acidic than it was 40 years ago. That combination of extra heat and different chemistry in the ocean is now wreaking violent damage. Sue and I were in the far Pacific 18 months or so ago with our colleagues at 350 in the Pacific who do amazing work trying to protect those low-lying islands. But we happened to be there when the wave of warm water in 2017, the warmest year ever recorded on this planet, when that wave of warm water swept over the course of a couple of weeks across the Pacific and the Indian Oceans, and as it did so, it wiped out 50, 60, 80, in some places 100% of the coral reefs around those atolls and islands. The Great Barrier Reef is the largest living structure on our planet, but it is half as living as it was 18 months ago. Okay? You can see the way that heat is expressed in the way that hydrological cycles around the planet have changed, the way that water moves. If you wanted one fact to hold in your mind to understand this century, it would probably be that warm air holds more water vapor than cold. That means that in arid areas, you get far more evaporation and far more drought. As you know, we meet today while our countrymen in California are coping with what looks like it may turn out to be one of, if not the biggest firestorms that's ever hit that state. That whole cities that 36 hours ago were intact are now in ashes. That's the kind of thing we see more and more of all over the planet. Once that water has evaporated up into the atmosphere, it is going to come down. The average residence time for a molecule of water vapor in the atmosphere is only about 7 days. So when it comes down now, it comes down hard in deluge that we haven't seen before. The U.S. set the new record for the largest rainfall event in our history last month. When Hurricane Harvey came ashore in Texas, some places saw 54 inches of rain, 4.5 feet of rain. Think about that. We can see it in the way that wind, that storm has changed. The great cyclones and hurricanes of our earth draw their power from the heat in the first few meters of the sea's surface. When you raise the temperature of that water, you allow them to become more powerful. September, the month just concluded, September of this year was the most hurricane activity, what the scientists call accumulated cyclonic energy, that we've ever recorded in a month in the Atlantic. We saw what that meant in Puerto Rico when our countrymen and women there took the full brunt in the eye of a Category 5 hurricane, ripped diagonally across that country and devastated everything in its path. I'm sure that most of you already have. I hope that people, when they go home, will try to figure out something material to do to help people in the recovery from one of the greatest catastrophes we've ever witnessed in this country. We see the effect simply in the sheer heat that now envelops parts of this planet. A couple of times in the last 18 months, we've set the record for the highest reliably recorded temperature ever measured on this planet. In cities in Pakistan and in Iraq, big cities like Basra, the temperature has gotten above 129 degrees Fahrenheit. We're feeling warm today. It's 80 degrees out. Think what it would feel like to add 50 degrees to the temperature we're feeling now. People can't work when it's 129 degrees. People can't sleep when it's 129 degrees. People really can't live very long if it stays 129 degrees because your body simply can't cool off fast enough. When Paul Winter and Janet Ye were playing and summoning up the beauty of this world that we were born into, it is sobering to reflect on how much we have already changed that planet, how discordant some of those notes are already becoming on this earth. This is already the biggest thing that human beings have ever done, and the most unjust, because there's an almost perfect inverse relationship between how much of this trouble you caused and how quickly and how hard it comes after you. So that's the first consideration about pace. So far, we've done a lot of damage. The second consideration is what the pace of damage is likely to be in the years ahead. Even if all the nations of the world kept the promises that they made as part of the Paris Climate Accords. And of course, our nation, the largest contributor over time to carbon in the atmosphere, has already announced it will renege, break, go back on the promises it made in Paris, something that should cause every American a real pang of shame. But even if we kept those promises, the actions that countries have pledged are small enough and slow enough that the temperature of the earth would continue to rise something like 3.5 degrees Celsius in the lifetime of people in this room, 6 or 7 degrees. If indeed we allow that to happen, then we cannot have civilizations like the ones we are used to having. That is the bottom line. Those zones, when it becomes too hot for human beings really to successfully inhabit places, will expand steadily out from the equator till they cover a sizable portion of the Earth's surface. And as people retreat above them and below them to find some respite from the heat, they'll find a host of other problems, some of them extremely basic. We believe at this point that each degree increase in global average temperature should cut grain yields something like 10%. All right? So if I've told you that it's going to raise temperature 3 degrees, you can do the math in your head and figure out what that's going to be like on a planet with 7 billion headed for 9 billion people and less in the way of calories. We're already seeing dramatic rises in sea level, okay? Enough so that coastal cities are already threatened. There were pictures 3 days ago from Miami where there was a so-called king tide, the high tide of the year with the full moon, and water was in the streets of Miami Beach just like it had been when Hurricane Irma came through a couple of weeks before. But we've just begun to see what's going on. We've understood now that we are near tipping points in Greenland and in the West Antarctic, and that continental ice that's currently above rock is beginning to melt in much the same way that the sea ice has already melted. When that sea ice melted, it did not raise the sea any more than melting the ice in your drink sends it over the top. But when that ice that's above rock melts, it does indeed raise the sea's surface. We thought as recently as 2 or 3 years ago that we might get away with as little as a meter, 3 feet of sea level rise this century. Those numbers now seem very optimistic indeed, and we're looking at 2 or maybe 3 times that much, and then extending far on into the future, because the last time we let carbon dioxide get as high as it currently is, hundreds of thousands of years ago, the sea level settled many meters higher than it is now, high enough to make sure that we can't inhabit the coastal cities where so much of our population now lives, high enough to make sure that much of the world's richest farmland, the river deltas and plains, especially of Asia, will be underwater and unproductive. We worry that we're very near, the tipping point because of that melt in Greenland, where the conveyor belt of ocean current that brings warmth north from the tropics will begin to slow or even collapse. An enormous effect. And we're worried, in fact, we're all but certain, that if we keep on this same path of pouring ever more carbon into the atmosphere, that the oceans will go from their current, already perilously acidified state into something much darker than that. A conference of marine biologists meeting a year and a half ago, at the end of the conference, published their joint report. They said that on current trends, we can expect an ocean that by century's end is, in their words, sour, hot, and choking. Okay? All of this means that we are at least in the beginning stages of what is likely to become the sixth great mass extinction event on this planet. We think that the other extinction events, even the most recent, have been driven at least in part by the same thing we're seeing now, the release of massive quantities of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as natural deposits of coal or gas or oil were burned by volcanic activity. Now it is us that is doing the burning, and we're doing it more quickly than we've ever seen in the geologic record. So that is the pace of the immediate future. This is what happens if we keep doing what we're doing now. If we keep on the pace that we congratulated ourselves at Paris for getting on, okay? That's what happens. Which brings me to the third section, a nicer one. All right. The possible pace of the future is very different. We have been given a great gift in the last decade. The engineers have done their job and done it very, very well indeed. The price of a solar panel has fallen 80% in the last decade. Around the world, most places, wind energy is now the cheapest way that we can produce electrons. That means that we're, because of that gift of the engineers, at the outer edge of possible of changing those numbers very dramatically, of moving far beyond what people talked about in Paris. Mark Jacobson and his team at Stanford have produced plans for 139 nations around the world, and really all the ones with significant carbon footprints, showing that by 2030, in all of them, we could be generating 80% of the power that we use from the sun, from the wind, and from water, from hydroelectricity. It would take an extraordinary amount of work to do that, but if we did, we would be very much on the path to upsetting that math, to getting way ahead of the pace that we'd set for ourselves. And there are tantalizing glimpses around the world of places that are making it happen. If you go to Denmark, you will find them generating half their power from the wind. Either the sly and crafty Danes have figured out a way to steal the world's wind supply for themselves, or they have figured out how to take advantage of the same resources available to all of us. The resource they've added is the political will to make it happen and happen fast. I had the extraordinary pleasure of being in pretty remote rural parts of Africa for a good portion of the spring, doing some reporting for the New Yorker. I was in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, and then across to East Africa and Tanzania, looking at villages that have never had power and really would not have gotten it at best for several lifetimes if they were waiting on the grid to slowly expand. There's still more than 1 billion people on this planet without power. More people lack electricity now than lacked electricity the day that Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. Okay? Almost all of them in Africa, or a lot in Asia, but the bulk in Africa. It was incredibly beautiful to see those places come literally to light for the first time because solar panels had gotten cheap enough that the 30 cents a day that people were spending for the kerosene to run one guttering lamp that filled their house with smoke would now leverage, through the miracle of small amounts of credit, a solar panel on the roof and an inverter on the wall and 4 or 5 LED lights and a cell phone charger and maybe a small television. I sat one day, hot day, much hotter than this, in Ghana with the elders of a village that had just turned on this solar microgrid in their village. 40 or 50 small houses there, huts were now wired for the first time, and these elders of this village were obviously very happy, and they kept giving me bottles of cold water to drink, which I was grateful for because it was very hot. It took me, in my clueless American way, a few minutes to figure out why they were quite so proud and happy to be giving me bottles of cold water. Until 2 weeks before, there had never been anything cold in that village. Okay? That was the first time. It was beautiful to see that, and beautiful to reflect that it came from the entirely benign process of pointing a sheet of black glass at the sky.
A nice phrase. Power your home by pointing a piece of black glass at the sky. Change of story. You certainly remember the terrible floods across the Houston area in August as a part of Hurricane Harvey. One photo is very memorable. A group of residents of a nursing home sitting and knitting in water up to their waists. The photo was taken in Dickson, Texas, a town that suffered through 50 inches of rain. Now the town is again in the news because of an absurd requirement on rehabbing houses. To fix up your devastated house and get a loan from the government, you have to make a pledge not to boycott Israel. I'm not making that up. Look at the language. It's basically a pledge of allegiance to Israel. According to the Jewish group, if not now, it was the Houston Jewish Federation who put the town up to this unheard of requirement. Why not write an email to the mayor and tell her what you think of this? And this incident makes plain that Jewish nationalists, in their utter arrogance, intend to make this requirement on every conceivable government action. Now some stunning footage from inside a prison in Homs, Syria. 500 political prisoners are on hunger strike now for 4 days. They're yelling slogans like freedom and death rather than humiliation. It takes incredible bravery. Assad forces could and may massacre all of them. Please contact human rights organizations and ask them to speak out. Now for something positive. You know that our government is approving climate-killing drilling and pipelines as fast as it can. Some people opposing this criminal recklessness are protesting by turning off pipelines, by shutting valves. The latest cases in Minnesota, it involves valve turners Emily Johnston and Annette Klapstein, as well as videographer Steve Lepte and support person Ben Duresma. They'll be standing trial for their actions. The positive part is that the judge will allow them to present a necessity defense. Necessity means legal innocence when you do something that breaks the law because it is an emergency. For instance, if you broke into a house to rescue people who didn't know it was on fire. What we did is not in dispute, said Annette Klapstein. The only question before the jury will be whether our action was necessary to prevent imminent climate catastrophe. Now we'll be able to present evidence connecting the devastation we're seeing from hurricanes in the Caribbean to wildfires throughout Western North America, to an oil-soaked political system utterly failing to respond. What the judge allowed is big. As Bill McKibben says, the whole planet will be inside that courtroom the day this trial begins. The longtime activist and leader Joanne Landy has died. She was a co-founder of the Campaign for Peace and Democracy East-West, which later became known as the Campaign for Peace and Democracy. It openly supported dissident democratic and socialist activists in Eastern Europe at a time when many in the Western left said it was only proper to criticize the United States and its allies. In the past decade, she was a big supporter of left forces in Greece that tried to stand up to the pitiless assault of the European banks. Joanne was also active in RPM, the Revive the Peace Movement network. The video you'll see is an interview I did with her in 1994 for a program called It's Radical. We were talking about Haiti and President Aristide, who had just been overthrown in a coup and who had attempted to make concessions to get the U.S. to put him back in office.
It's understandable that he has made such compromises. I think it's a mistake. I think it was a mistake to, looking backwards now, not arm the Haitian people while he had the presidency, so that people wouldn't end up in the kind of situation that they're in now, to not have prepared more for the kind of coup that deposed him. And since he's been in this country, I think, putting myself in his shoes, I would have not put the spotlight so much on Washington to solve the problems, but more on the Haitian people to do so.
Well, that was amazing. The first thing he did when he was expelled was go meet with Bush, President Bush.
Okay, but I mean, although I think it's a mistake, I think that we shouldn't leap into a kind of easy condemnation of this approach by Aristide. After all, here's a man who lives next to a country that claims to be democratic, who is facing a brutal and vicious military, and he naturally hopes for some kind of solution. He hopes that he's able to bring enough political pressure because of the popular support that he has in this country. He hopes to be able to put up enough political pressure on the American presidency to, whether it wants to or not, to support him, as it was forced to do about Mandela and the ANC in South Africa. So it's an understandable perspective, but I think he's taken it too far and not done enough to build the power of the Haitian people to the kind of confrontation that he understandably fears, but which is really the only way that there's going to be any real justice or peace in Haiti.
There was a tribute to Joanne Landy in New York City in June. It included video in her honor from a Polish rock band. We'll show a portion of it.
Protestu chcieliśmy zadedykować naszej przyjaciółce z Nowego Jorku, Joanne Landy. To jest działaczka ruchów pacyfistycznych, ruchów na rzecz demokracji, która w czasach komuny, w czasach PRL-u pomagała tutaj polskiej opozycji, pomagała uczestnikom ruchu Wolność i Pokój, kiedy wsadzano nas do więzień, to ona walczyła w Stanach.
Gdy ktoś zawłaszcza moją wolność, mówię nie. Gdy niszczą to, co kocham, to się czuję źle. Bo dobra...
Joanne Landy, present always in our hearts and minds. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.